Have you ever wondered how there was a time when justice didn't mean fairness? It meant fear, pain, suffering that lasted hours, sometimes days. Long ago, rulers and leaders believed that the more painful the punishment, the stronger the message. Imagine being placed inside a hollow metal bull. Fire burns underneath you. As you scream, the sound echoes through pipes and comes out like the roar of an animal. This wasn't a story. It was real. And it was only one of many ways people were killed in history. Some of these execution methods are so cruel, they were banned forever. Some were forgotten. Others were too strange to believe, but they happened. And in this video, we are going to look at the darkest execution methods ever used in history. You'll travel through ancient times to the modern era. You'll hear about punishments that sound like horror movies, but every one of them is real. And if you stick around till the end, you'll hear about one execution method so twisted, most historians still argue whether it really happened, or if it was too awful to write down. Let's begin. Long before prisons and courtrooms, ancient civilizations had their own ways of dealing with crime. But justice back then wasn't just about stopping someone. It was about making sure everyone else watched and feared. Let's start with scaphism, used in ancient Persia. This was one of the most disturbing methods ever recorded. The victim was placed between two hollowed-out boats, almost like a coffin made of wood. Only the head, hands, and feet stuck out. Then they were force-fed milk and honey. Sounds strange, right? But it wasn't kindness. The milk caused diarrhea, and the honey attracted insects. Then, more honey was rubbed all over their body, especially on the exposed skin. The boats were then left out in the hot sun, sometimes on a river. Over days, insects came in swarms. They bit, laid eggs, and slowly ate the person alive. Death didn't come quickly. It took days of suffering. Some victims lasted over a week. Now, let's move to the ancient Assyrians. They were one of the earliest and most brutal empires. One of their punishments was flaying, skinning a person alive. The skin would be peeled slowly from the body while the victim was still breathing. Sometimes, the skin was nailed to a wall as a warning. This wasn't just pain. It was meant to shame, to show power. The Assyrians didn't hide their cruelty. They carved it into stone so the world would remember. Then there was boiling alive, used in several parts of the world including ancient China and parts of Europe. The victim was dropped into a large pot of water, oil. It was then slowly heated until boiling. The pain was unbearable. There was no escape. In some cases, the executioners added herbs, not to ease the pain, but to make it smell like cooking meat. This was punishment turned into a public show. These ancient methods weren't just about killing. They were about fear, about power, and they show us just how far people would go to control others. But if you think that was bad, wait until you hear what the Greeks and Romans did, because they turned executions into art and horror. That's coming up next. The ancient Greeks and Romans gave us philosophy, art, and law. But they also gave us some of the cruelest execution methods in history. They believed punishment should be public, painful, and unforgettable. Let's start with the Brazen Bull, one of the most infamous torture devices from ancient Greece. It was a large metal statue shaped like a bull, hollow inside. A person was locked inside, and a fire was lit underneath. As the metal heated up, the victim slowly burned alive. But that's not all. Pipes were built into the bull's head so that screams would echo through the metal and come out sounding like a bull's roar. The inventor of the Brazen Bull, a man named Perillos, brought it to the ruler Phalaris as a gift. But Phalaris wanted to test it on Perillos himself. He threw him inside. That's how cruel this world was. Invent horror, and you might suffer it first. Next is crucifixion, made famous by the Romans. It wasn't just a method of execution. It was a long, painful death designed to break the spirit. Victims were nailed or tied to wooden crosses. They didn't die quickly. It took hours, sometimes days. The real goal was to make people watch, to show what happened to those who went against the empire. Crucifixion was so common that entire roads were lined with crosses. It wasn't about justice. It was about power and terror. But the Romans didn't stop there. They had a lesser-known method called the sack execution, or poena callae. It was saved for one crime, killing a parent. The punishment? The person was sewn into a leather sack along with live animals, usually a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster. Then the sack was thrown into a river. The animals would panic and attack inside the dark, tight space. Death came from drowning, bites, or terror. It was strange, ritualistic, and designed to erase the criminal from the world. What's shocking is how carefully these punishments were planned. They weren't random acts of rage. They were rules, part of the system. Pain was part of the process. But believe it or not, the darkest methods were still to come. Because in the Middle Ages, cruelty reached a whole new level. Let's move there next. The Middle Ages are often called the Dark Ages, and for good reason. This was a time when punishment wasn't just brutal. It was creative, slow, and made to be watched. Executions became public events. Towns gathered to see people suffer. And some of the most terrifying methods in history were born during this time. One of the worst was the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel. The victim's limbs were tied to a large wooden wheel. Then, with a heavy iron bar, the executioner smashed their arms and legs, one by one. The bones broke, and the limbs twisted around the spokes. Sometimes, the broken body was left on display until the person died, slowly, in public. Other times, they were given a final blow to the chest, called the mercy stroke. But mercy wasn't always given. Next comes rat torture. This one was simple but sickening. A metal container with a rat inside was placed on the victim's stomach. The container was then heated from the outside. With nowhere to go, the rat would start digging, through skin, through flesh, trying to escape. This method was used in parts of Europe and Asia. There are even stories of it happening during wars, when prisoners were tortured for secrets. It's hard to prove how common it was, but the idea alone is enough to make your skin crawl. Then there was sawing in half. The victim was hung upside down, which kept the brain full of blood and the person conscious longer. Then they were slowly sawed from the groin down to the head. Yes, upward. This method was used in the Middle East and parts of Europe. Some records even say it was used against rebels and religious enemies. It was slow. It was loud. And it sent a message: never cross the rulers. Now we come to one of the most famous, but also most debated, devices, the Iron Maiden. You've probably seen it in movies or games. A coffin-shaped box lined with sharp metal spikes. When the doors closed, the spikes would pierce the body, but not deep enough to kill quickly. The victim would bleed slowly, stuck between life and death. But here's the twist. Many historians believe the Iron Maiden may have been made up or exaggerated later, around the 18th or 19th century. Still, it's become a symbol of medieval cruelty. During the Middle Ages, these punishments weren't just about justice. They were theatre. They were warnings. And they worked. People feared breaking the rules not because of jail, but because of what would happen to their bodies in front of a crowd. But even as the world became more modern, the executions didn't become kinder. In fact, some of the most disturbing methods came much later. Let's go there next. As the world moved into the 1600s and beyond, many countries began building laws, courts, and structured governments. But don't be fooled. The punishments didn't get softer. In many cases, they got even more painful and more public. In England, there was a punishment called hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was used for people accused of treason, going against the king. First, the person was dragged through the streets on a wooden board. Then they were hanged, but not until death, just enough to choke. After that, their stomach was cut open. Their organs were pulled out and burned in front of them. Finally, their body was chopped into 4 parts, the quartering. The head was placed on a spike above the city gate. This wasn't just an execution. It was a message in blood: betray the crown, and this will be you. Next, let's look at keel hauling, used by the Dutch and British navies. This method was used to punish sailors who broke rules. The person was tied with ropes and dragged underneath the ship, from one side to the other. The bottom of the ship was covered in sharp barnacles. As the victim passed under, their skin was ripped apart. If they didn't drown, they'd often die later from infection. It was slow, salty, and full of suffering. Across the world in China, there was linkai, also known as death by 1,000 cuts. This punishment was saved for the worst crimes, like murder or betrayal. The executioner would slowly cut pieces of the person's body, arms, legs, chest, while keeping them alive. The goal wasn't just to kill. It was to humiliate, to make the person suffer in front of a crowd. Sometimes, the victim was given a special drug to keep them awake and numb the pain, so the process could last even longer. These methods show something strange about this time in history. People were trying to build order, rules, law, and structure, but their punishments were just as cruel as the chaos they tried to stop. There was no mercy, just a new way to scare the public into obedience. But as we moved into the 20th century, with machines, technology, and science, you'd think things got better. Right? You might want to think again. Let's take a look at how modern methods of execution can be just as dark, if not darker. By the 20th century, the world had changed. There were cars, electricity, radios, and modern governments. But even with all that progress, executions didn't end. They just became more efficient, colder, faster, and in some cases, even more terrifying. Let's start with gas vans, used during World War II by Nazi Germany. These looked like normal delivery trucks from the outside. Victims were told they were being moved. But once the doors closed, exhaust from the engine was pumped inside. People inside slowly choked on carbon monoxide as the truck drove away. No screaming, no crowd, no mess. Just quiet death, hidden behind metal. It was one of the first steps toward mass killings, and a chilling example of murder disguised as transport. In the United States, the electric chair was introduced in the late 1800s, but was used heavily in the 20th century. It was seen as a more humane way to execute someone. But in truth, it often went horribly wrong. The person would be strapped to a wooden chair, and electricity would be sent through their body. Sometimes they died quickly, but other times, it took multiple shocks. Skin burned, blood boiled. In one case, a man's head actually caught fire. These stories were kept quiet, but they still happened, behind prison walls. And perhaps one of the most horrifying chapters came from Unit 731 in Japan during World War II. This was a secret military unit that performed experiments on live prisoners. Some were frozen and then cut open to see the damage. Others were exposed to diseases or had body parts removed without anesthesia. These weren't quick executions. They were long, cruel experiments. And for many years, they were hidden from the world. Even in modern times, when science and medicine had advanced, cruelty didn't disappear. It simply wore a lab coat or a uniform. But now, we've reached the moment you've been waiting for. The method so dark, so strange, some historians still debate if it was even real. It's time to reveal the one execution that may be more legend than fact, but still terrifying enough to keep you awake at night. This is the one you saw in the title. The method so gruesome, so twisted, that even historians argue if it ever truly happened. It's called the Blood Eagle, and it comes from Viking legends. According to old texts, it was used as a punishment for traitors or enemies of great importance. Here's how it's described. The victim's ribs were cut near the spine and pulled outward, breaking them to resemble wings. Then, their lungs were pulled through the gaps, laid out across their back like feathers, all while they were still alive. To make it worse, salt was sometimes rubbed into the wounds to keep them awake longer. No one knows for sure if the Blood Eagle was real or just a myth meant to scare enemies. Some believe it was ritual. Others think it was exaggeration. But the idea stuck, because it wasn't just about death, it was about sending a message so cruel, no one would dare cross the Vikings again. Whether the Blood Eagle truly happened or not, it shows us something powerful. Sometimes, the idea of a punishment is as terrifying as the punishment itself. And now you've heard it, the execution method's so brutal, you wouldn't believe it unless you saw it in the history books. But before we end, there's one last thing you should hear. Let's wrap this up. Throughout history, people have used pain as power. From ancient Persia to modern times, executions weren't just about ending a life. They were about control, fear, and making a point. Some methods were slow. Some were loud. Some were hidden. But all of them show just how far humans have gone to punish others. It makes you wonder, were these people monsters? Or were they just following the rules of their time? Even today, we still argue about what justice means, about what's fair, about how to deal with those who do harm. And when we look back at these dark methods, we see more than horror. We see a warning. Which method shocked you the most? Was it the Brazen Bull, the breaking wheel, or the Blood Eagle? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video and you want more dark history and mystery stories, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. Thanks for watching, And remember, the past may be gone, but its shadows still linger.